The war had ended in fire, blood, and silence. Humanity, once a rising power in the galaxy, had been crushed beneath the boots of the Dominion. Earth was burned to ash, its once great fleets shattered and scattered like drifting corpses in the void. The last human stronghold, Karen IV, had fallen with defiant screams and nuclear fire. And at the center of that final doomed battle, High Lord Gabriel Voss had died, executed before a jeering Dominion audience as a warning to any who dared defy their rule. Or so the galaxy believed. Deep in the void, beyond the reach of sensors, a warship drifted in absolute silence. The Nemesis was a ghost of a bygone war, an ancient Terran battleship lost in the chaos of humanity's last stand. Its hull was scared, blackened by battle and time, a relic of a species that had supposedly been wiped from existence. But deep within its lightless corridors, something stirred. The ship's core pulsed with eerie blue light as ancient systems, long dormant, flickered back to life. A whisper ran through the ship's databanks, activating sealed protocols older than the Dominion itself. The whisper became a voice, and the voice called to the dead. In the heart of the ship, a coffin-like pod shuddered, then cracked open with a hiss of escaping vapor. Tubes and cables snapped away from the figure inside. A man, a warrior, fell forward, catching himself against the cold metal floor with unnatural reflexes. His breath came ragged, his vision a blur of shifting red data streams. His body felt both foreign and familiar, his limbs heavy yet powerful, his mind flickering between memories of death and the undeniable sensation of being alive. Then, like a blade cutting through fog, clarity returned. Gabriel Voss rose to his feet, his hands clenched into fists, feeling the hardened, reinforced plating beneath his skin. Enhancements from the Revenant core's forbidden experiments. He remembered dying. He remembered the Dominion's executioner driving a plasma blade through his chest. He remembered the agony of his body breaking, his vision fading to black. But he also remembered something else. The contingency. Project Revenant. A desperate, last-ditch effort by humanity's warlords to defy extinction. The Dominion had executed them, yes, but they had unknowingly killed men who had already been rewritten, their minds and bodies rebuilt by nanotechnological resurrection protocols buried deep in the Nemesis systems. Their deaths had been real, but they had not been permanent. Voss turned his head as the sound of more pods unlocking filled the chamber. All around him, figures stirred. Cybernetic warriors gasped for breath as they returned from the abyss, their eyes flashing with a cold, eerie light. The dead were rising. A familiar voice rasped behind him. "How long has it been?" Voss turned to see Colonel Adrienne Kane stepping forward, her black combat plating still riddled with old wounds. She had been his second-in-command on Karen IV, and she had died beside him. Now she stood once more. Voss looked toward the ship's central console. Data flooded his mind, feeding him grim truths. A century had passed. Humanity was gone. The Dominion ruled uncontested. His jaw tightened. His hands flexed, feeling the strength coursing through his reborn body. The galaxy thought them dead. It would soon learn otherwise. The Nemesis drifted in the black void, its engines silent, its hull hidden beneath layers of countermeasures designed to render it a ghost. Inside, Gabriel Voss stood before a massive holo-display, his cybernetic eyes scanning streams of data, colony records, military reports, supply chains, anything that would lead them to the scattered remnants of humanity. The Dominion had spent a century erasing his species, but no empire, no matter how powerful, could exterminate every last ember of resistance. There had to be survivors, and where there were survivors, there would be suffering. A flashing red marker drew his attention. Ulthar Prime, a Dominion-controlled factory world in the outer systems, rich in resources, heavily fortified, and home to a labor force of enslaved humans. "How many?" Voss asked, his voice edged with steel. Adrienne Kane, standing beside him, tapped a control panel, pulling up grim statistics. Estimates place the number at 20,000. Forced into labor camps, working until their bodies give out. Most of them likely don't remember Earth. They were either taken as children after the war or born under Dominion rule. Voss exhaled slowly. And the garrison? Moderate defenses, Kane said. A handful of Dominion enforcers, orbital security platforms, and a planetary governor. Threxian cased, most likely. She met Voss's gaze. We could hit it, but it won't be quiet. The Dominion will respond fast. Voss clenched his fists. The old, cautious part of him, the part that had once commanded fleets and calculated the cost of war, whispered restraint. They were only a handful of Revenant lords, newly reborn, their numbers still too few. A direct strike would draw attention. But the man who had been executed a century ago, the man who had watched his people die while the Dominion laughed, had no patience for restraint. "We're not here to be quiet," he said. "We're here to remind the galaxy who we are." Kane gave a sharp nod. "Then let's make them remember. ####." The attack came without warning. The night sky of Ulfar Prime split open as the Nemesis descended from orbit like a blade of fire. Anti-air defenses scrambled to respond, turrets swiveling, targeting systems locking onto the warship. But they were already too late. The Nemesis unleashed a storm of kinetic rounds and plasma lances, obliterating the security towers in an instant. Then, from the darkness, the Revenant lords fell. They dropped from high-altitude insertion pods, hitting the ground with the impact of living missiles. Their cybernetic frames absorbed the shock, and before the Dominion enforcers could react, the slaughter began. Voss moved like a specter of war, his plasma-edged blade carving through armored guards in a blur of movement. Kane followed close behind, twin Gauss pistols spitting death with inhuman precision. The other Revenant lords fanned out, a dozen cybernetic nightmares tearing through the Dominion forces with terrifying speed and efficiency. The human slaves watched in stunned silence. Many had never seen a human warrior before, only their oppressors. Then, as the last Dominion overseer fell, one of the slaves, a gaunt man with hollow eyes, staggered forward. He stared at Voss, at the armored, blood-stained figure standing amidst the wreckage. "Who are you?" he asked, voice raw with disbelief. Voss met his gaze. "We are the dead," he said, "and we have come for vengeance." The fires of Ulfar Prime still burned as Gabriel Voss stood atop the ruins of the governor's palace. Below him, thousands of freed humans gathered, their faces a mix of awe, fear, and disbelief. A century of Dominion rule had taught them that resistance was futile, that humanity was extinct, that fighting back would only bring annihilation. Tonight, that belief had been shattered. The Revenant lords stood among them, their cybernetic bodies still slick with the blood of their enemies. Voss's gaze swept over the crowd. Emaciated laborers, children born in chains, warriors who had long since given up hope. He took a step forward, his voice cold and unyielding. "The Dominion calls us dead," he said. "They tell you humanity is gone, that there is no future beyond the chains they wrap around your necks." His glowing eyes scanned the gathered masses. They lied. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some still cowered, afraid this was a trick. Others clenched their fists, a long dormant fire igniting in their eyes. "The Dominion will return," Voss continued. "They will come with fire and fury to erase what we have done here. They will not offer mercy. They will not take prisoners." He let the silence hang for a moment before his voice hardened. "We will not kneel." A moment passed, then another. Then a single voice rang out. A woman, her face lined with years of suffering, her hands stained with the labor of 100 lifetimes. "No kneeling," she whispered. Another joined, then another. Soon, the words became a chant, rising like a storm. "No kneeling, no kneeling, no kneeling." A ghost of a smirk crossed Voss's face. The Dominion would come for them soon, but for the first time in a century, Humanity wasn't just surviving. It was rising. On the bridge of the Nemesis, Adrian Kane stood beside Voss, watching tactical displays flicker with incoming data. Dominion forces had already detected the attack. Patrol fleets were rerouting. Scout ships would arrive within the next 2 days. A full invasion force would follow. "We can't hold Ulfar Prime," Kane said, arms crossed. "Not with what we have." Voss didn't look away from the display. "We were never here to hold it." Kane glanced at him. "Then what's the plan?" "The Dominion still thinks they rule unchallenged," Voss said. "They think of us as ghosts. A myth." He turned, his expression cold. "We're going to make them afraid of the dark." He tapped a command into the console, bringing up a galaxy-wide map. Points of light flickered, planets where humanity had once thrived, now under Dominion control. "Every enslaved human, every lost warrior, every broken remnant of our people will hear what happened here," Voss said. "They'll see the Dominion bleed, and they will know the truth." Kane exhaled, a slow grin creeping across her face. "We're not just here to fight. We're here to start a war." Voss nodded. "And this time, we do not lose." Far across the galaxy, in the heart of the Dominion, Supreme Overlord Threxus leaned forward as reports flooded in. His slitted, reptilian eyes narrowed as he read the impossible words. Ulfar Prime had fallen. Not to pirates. Not to insurgents. To the dead. He let out a slow, hissing breath. "Impossible," he muttered. But deep within his mind, a whisper of something ancient, something the Dominion had long forgotten, coiled like a serpent around his thoughts. Fear. The Dominion fleet arrived in force. The first wave came within 48 hours. Scout ships, fast attack corvettes, and orbital suppression craft, all sweeping into Ulfar Prime's system like hunting beasts. The second wave followed soon after. Full-sized warships, escorting Dominion shock troops bred for planetary pacification. But they did not find a rebellion waiting for them. They found silence. Ulfar Prime was abandoned. The factories stood empty, their forges cold. The slave camps had been gutted, the chains left behind as a final insult. And in the center of the governor's ruined palace, a single message flickered in Terran war code, pulsing in crimson light. "We do not kneel." By the time the Dominion forces realized they had been outmaneuvered, the Nemesis was already light years away, its slip-space drive tearing through the void. But their escape had come at a cost. The Nemesis war room was bathed in red warning lights. Data streams flickered across the displays, showing damage reports from the last-minute firefight during their retreat. The ship had taken a glancing hit from a Dominion torpedo, and while the hull had held, their cloaking systems had been compromised. The Dominion would be able to track them now, at least partially. Adrienne Kane paced near the central command table, her cybernetic fingers drumming against her gauntlet. "We can't run forever. They're going to come harder now." Voss stood across from her, studying a star chart. "We don't run," he said. "We move." Kane narrowed her eyes. "Move where?" Voss tapped a single point on the map. A cold, dark system on the fringes of known space, a place that should have been dead. Blackfire Station. Kane stiffened. "That's Dominion territory." "Not just any territory," Voss said. "One of their primary intelligence hubs. It's where they track emerging threats, rogue fleets, uprisings, lost war tech." His gaze was hard. "It's where they'll be tracking us." Kane's brows furrowed. "You want us to attack a Dominion intelligence hub, with a damaged warship and a handful of Revenants?" Voss didn't hesitate. "We don't have a choice. The Dominion thinks they're the hunters. We're going to make them the hunted." She exhaled slowly, then nodded. "Then let's do it right." The Nemesis dropped out of slip space at the edges of the Blackfire system, its stealth systems flickering under strain. The station loomed ahead, an armored behemoth hanging in orbit around a dying star. It was heavily shielded, surrounded by automated gun platforms and a Dominion garrison fleet. A direct assault would be suicide. which is why they weren't going to attack head-on. Kane and a small strike team launched in a stealth insertion pod, using the station's own sensor blind spots to slip into docking range. The plan was precise, surgical. Get inside, extract intelligence on Dominion troop movements, then disappear before the alarms went off. But as soon as they breached the station's hull, the trap was sprung. The Dominion was waiting. Gunfire erupted as armored enforcers poured into the corridors, weapons blazing. Kane dove for cover, her Gauss pistols already spitting return fire. 2 Revenants went down in the first few seconds, their enhanced bodies still no match for the overwhelming force. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged, tall, armored in sleek, obsidian plating. Its face was hidden behind a smooth, featureless mask, but its voice was unmistakable. "You're predictable, Voss," the figure said through the station's comms. "Did you really think you could strike at us unnoticed?" Voss, watching from the Nemesis, clenched his jaw as recognition hit. He knew that voice. It belonged to a traitor, one of their own. Far above the battlefield, the Dominion fleet closed in. The Nemesis was outnumbered. The Revenant strike team was compromised, and the enemy knew their every move. Voss had walked them into an ambush, and now the war for humanity's survival might end before it had even begun. Gunfire filled the corridors of Blackfire Station, the sharp crack-crack of Gauss rounds tearing through Dominion enforcers. Adrian Kane dropped behind cover, ejecting an overheated magazine and slamming in a fresh one. The ambush had been swift and brutal. Half of their Revenant strike team was already down, and the Dominion forces were closing in. But the worst part wasn't the firepower pinning them down. It was the voice on the station's comms. "You've grown sloppy, Voss." The traitor's voice echoed, cold and amused. "I thought resurrection would make you smarter." Kane grit her teeth, pressing a hand to her ear. "Voss, we've been compromised." They knew we were coming. Aboard the Nemesis, Gabriel Voss stood motionless, his cybernetic mind processing the grim reality. The Dominion had always been powerful, but not this efficient, not this precise. Someone had fed them information, someone who had once fought alongside humanity. The traitor spoke again, and this time, the words twisted like a knife in Voss's chest. "You should have stayed dead, Gabriel." Voss had no time for anger. He had a team to save. "Kane," he said, his voice level, "can you reach the station's central core?" She fired a burst from her Gauss pistol, dropping a Dominion soldier before responding. "Maybe, but we'll be ripped apart before we get there." Voss's mind raced. Blackfire Station wasn't just an intelligence hub. It was a command relay, which meant it had a direct uplink to Dominion fleet movements across the sector. If they could reach the core, they wouldn't just escape. They'd gain access to critical war data. And they needed that data. "Kane, listen carefully," Voss said. "We're overriding the station's security grid from the Nemesis. You'll have a 30-second window to reach the core. After that, I'm blowing the entire station off the map." Kane didn't hesitate. "Copy that." Voss turned to his bridge crew. "Begin the override. Now." The station shuddered as its automated turrets turned inward, suddenly targeting Dominion troops instead of the Revenants. The enforcers hesitated, only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. Kane and the remaining Revenants surged forward, cutting down the distracted soldiers. The traitor's voice returned, now laced with irritation. "Clever," he admitted, "but delaying the inevitable." Kane ignored him. She reached the control room, forcing the blast doors open with brute cybernetic strength. The station's central data core loomed before her, a pulsing pillar of Dominion war intelligence. She plugged in a data spike. "I'm in." Lines of code flashed across her visor. Fleet routes, supply chains, the location of occupied human enclaves. And then, her breath caught. The Black Bastion. Aboard the Nemesis, Voss saw the same data stream through his neural interface. His artificial heart almost stopped. The Black Bastion was real, a hidden Terran war vault. a last-ditch contingency built before humanity's fall. If the data was correct, it contained something, a forgotten arsenal, locked away beyond Dominion reach. Weapons, ships, maybe even the means to turn the tide. Kane's voice cut in, urgent. We have what we need. Get us out of here now. Voss turned to his helmsman. Prepare the slipspace drive. Outside, the Dominion fleet repositioned, moving to cut off their escape. The trader's voice came one last time, almost disappointed. This isn't over, Voss. Voss narrowed his eyes. No, it's just beginning. The Nemesis fired its main cannon, blasting apart the weakened station shields. Then, in a flash of light, it vanished into slipspace, carrying with it the key to humanity's return. The Nemesis tore through slipspace, its hull groaning under the strain. The data recovered from Blackfire Station pulsed through its systems, a relic of lost war plans, fleet movements, and the location of something far more valuable. The Black Bastion, a forgotten Terran stronghold, hidden in a dead sector of space, lost when the Dominion declared victory a century ago. If the intelligence was correct, it housed an arsenal that could shift the balance of power. Weapons, ships, enough to finish what humanity started. But there was no time for secrecy anymore. The Dominion had tracked them, and they were coming in force. Voss stood on the bridge, staring at the incoming threat. The Dominion's supreme warlord, Overlord Threxus himself, had deployed an extermination fleet. Hundreds of Dominion warships descended upon the sector like a swarm of locusts. They're committing everything to this, Kane muttered, scanning the displays. They want to end us now. Voss was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. Running was no longer an option. The war had been fought in the shadows for too long. If humanity was to rise again, it had to happen here. Now, he turned to the crew, his voice iron. Send a sector-wide broadcast. Kane frowned. To who? To everyone. The message rippled across the galaxy. The single, unencrypted transmission. Bold, reckless, defiant. Humanity does not kneel. Humanity does not die. Humanity rises. Across occupied worlds, broken warriors lifted their heads. On Dominion-controlled colonies, human laborers whispered the words in awe and fear. Mercenaries, outlaws, and exiled warlords saw it for what it was, a call to arms. And in the depths of space, old Terran war machines, buried beneath dust and time, flickered to life. The battle began before the Nemesis even reached the Black Bastion. The Dominion fleet surged forward, their warships forming an impenetrable wall of death. Plasma lances and kinetic rounds screamed through the void. But the Nemesis did not fight alone. Ships began dropping out of slipspace. Rogue Terran warships, pirate vessels, repurposed freighters carrying human refugees who had had enough. They had seen the message. They had chosen a side. They fought like demons. The void turned into a storm of fire. Human resistance ships rammed into Dominion cruisers, sacrificing themselves to break the blockade. Pilots who had never fired a weapon before tore into the enemy with reckless desperation. The Revenant lords led the charge, striking like vengeful ghosts, cutting through Dominion ranks with a ferocity that shook even Threx's hardened commanders. But even with the reinforcements, the Dominion still had the numbers. Until the Bastion awoke. Sensors screamed as something massive stirred beneath the dead world below. The Black Bastion was not just a stronghold. It was a dreadnought, a buried warship the size of a city, dormant for a century. And now, awakened by Voss's command, it rose. From its hull erupted a storm of Terran war drones, ancient weapons long thought lost. Dominion ships scrambled to reposition, but it was too late. The Bastion's main cannons opened fire, and the sky burned. The Dominion fleet fractured. And in the chaos, Voss found his target. Aboard his flagship, Overlord Threxus watched his fleet crumbling. His forces had outnumbered the enemy 100 to 1. And yet, for the first time in his rule, he felt something alien and unfamiliar clawing at the edges of his mind. Dread. Then his ship's alarms screamed as a boarding craft crashed through the hull. A single figure emerged from the smoke. Gabriel Voss, eyes burning, blade in hand, and he had come for vengeance. The Dominion flagship trembled as emergency sirens blared across its decks. Fires raged through the corridors where Terran boarding pods had torn through the ship's hull. The once mighty warlord Threxus, master of the Dominion, ruler of 100 conquered worlds, felt his command collapsing around him. And then came the footsteps. Gabriel Voss advanced through the wreckage, plasma blade humming in his grip. His armor was scorched, blood, some of it his, much of it not, splattered across his reinforced plating. Behind him, a handful of Revenant lords followed, their movements precise, relentless, inhuman. The ship's final line of defense stood between Voss and the Dominion's supreme warlord, an elite guard of Threxian warriors, their reptilian frames bristling with plasma-forged weapons. "You should not exist," one of them hissed. Voss tilted his head, his cybernetic eyes glowing. "And yet, here I am." Then he moved. He was a blur of motion, his blade slicing through the first warrior's chest before the others could react. Kane fired twin Gauss pistols, punching holes in another's skull. The Revenants followed like shadows of death, cutting down the last of the guards in mere seconds. Beyond them, the doors to the bridge stood sealed. Voss didn't slow. He thrust his fist forward, reinforced knuckles striking the locking mechanism with the force of a railgun impact. The doors shattered inward. Threxus stood at the far end of the bridge, his claws curled around the command console. His slitted eyes flickered between Voss and the burning void beyond the viewport. His empire was dying. His voice was steady, but beneath it lay something cold. Fear. "You are a relic of a dead species," Threxus snarled. "A nightmare that should have been forgotten." Voss stepped forward, his blade dripping Dominion blood. "Then let's remind the galaxy what nightmares can do." Threxus lunged, plasma claws extending from his armored gauntlet. He was fast, faster than any Dominion warrior Voss had ever faced. But Voss was faster. He sidestepped, twisting like a wraith, his blade flashing. Threxus barely parried in time, the impact sending sparks flying. The warlord struck again, a flurry of savage swipes meant to tear Voss apart. But Voss was no longer bound by mortal limits. He weaved through the assault, a ghost in the chaos. His blade slashed low, cutting through Threxus's leg plating, severing muscle and tendons. The warlord staggered. Voss didn't hesitate. He drove his blade straight through Threxus's chest. The Dominion ruler gasped, his body locking up in shock. His glowing yellow eyes flickered, staring at the impossible. The man he had executed a century ago standing before him, killing him. Voss leaned in, his voice a whisper. "We do not kneel." With a final twist, he ripped the blade free. Threxus collapsed, lifeless. ####. The moment the warlord fell, Dominion forces began to falter. The flagship's crew, seeing their leader slain, panicked. Communications broke down. And outside, the Black Bastion erased what remained of the Dominion fleet. The battle was over. And for the first time in 100 years, the Dominion had lost. The Dominion flagship was burning. Fires consumed its shattered hull, the once mighty warlord Threxus lying lifeless on the cold deck. Outside, the remnants of the Dominion fleet crumbled under the relentless assault of the Nemesis, the Black Bastion, and the ragtag human forces that had answered the call to arms. For the first time in a century, the Dominion bled. Gabriel Voss stood over Threxus's corpse, his blade still humming with residual energy. Around him, his Revenant lords watched in silence. Adrienne Kane exhaled, lowering her weapons. "It's done," she said. Voss looked down at the fallen overlord, then at the burning wreckage beyond the bridge's viewport. "No," he said quietly. "It's just beginning." Across the galaxy, the Dominion trembled. The warlord's death was not just a defeat, it was a message. The legend of the Revenant lords, of warriors who had risen from death to reclaim what was stolen, spread like wildfire. On occupied worlds, human slaves whispered the name Voss. Dominion governors locked down their colonies, fearing the inevitable uprisings. Some worlds revolted immediately, emboldened by the impossible victory at the Black Bastion. But the Dominion was vast, wounded but not yet broken, and it would strike back. The Black Bastion hovered in orbit above its dead world, its ancient systems flickering to full power for the first time in a century. Inside, Voss and Kane stood before a massive tactical display, analyzing data pulled from Dominion archives. "We have them on the defensive," Kane said, scrolling through intercepted transmissions. "They're panicking. High command is fractured, their warlords scrambling for control." Voss studied the data. "That won't last," he said. "The Dominion has ruled for too long to collapse overnight." Kane nodded grimly. "They'll regroup. And when they do, they'll throw everything at us." Voss turned to a secondary display, one that showed the names of surviving human enclaves scattered across the galaxy. Refugees, resistance cells, old warships hidden in asteroid fields, waiting for a reason to rise. "They've spent a century crushing us, dividing us," he said. "Now we make them regret it." He turned back to Kane, his eyes burning with renewed purpose. "We take the fight to them, not as scavengers, not as ghosts." He clenched his fist. "But as an army." Kane smirked. "Then we better start recruiting." Far beyond the Black Bastion, in the deepest reaches of Dominion space, a shadow watched. A lone figure sat in a silent chamber, watching battle reports scroll across a holoscreen. The fall of Thraxis, the loss of the Dominion flagship, the awakening of the Black Bastion. The figure's fingers curled into a fist. "The dead refused to stay buried," the traitor mused. Their voice was calm, cold, calculating. Then a slow smile. "Good." The war was far from over, and the Dominion was not the only enemy humanity would have to face.